Thank you for joining Community Planning Conversations today. Andrew Freear is joining me. Andrew is the director of the Rural Studio, the School of Architecture at Auburn University. And so our conversation is primarily going to be about the Rural Studio and the many projects that they have done since the inception. Andrew reminded me a couple of days ago that it's probably over 100 projects, so we have a lot to talk about and the excitement of it. Andrew, thank you so much. I just also want to tell everybody, Andrew is here for the 8th Annual Planning Institute that's sponsored by the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the university. And Alabama, you are immediately going to think you're going to hear a Southern accent, but what you're going to hear is an English accent because Andrew has migrated to our country from England. And how did that come about?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Of course.
If I'd known I was going to come and do this, I'd have had a makeover. But,
we don't need this.
This is real.
This is real. This is Andrew when he's in New Bern, Alabama, at the Rural Studio.
Yeah, I dress like a slob all of the time. So, oh goodness, I as an intern, well, not as an intern. Sorry. When I was an architecture student in London, I was looking for summer jobs and weekend jobs, and London's an expensive and tough place to work, to live. Sorry, and so I was looking around for some jobs and ended up being recommended to go and try a place called SOM, and I didn't know who the heck SOM was or what they were, but and SOM is a firm, a big Chicago firm called Skidmore, Rings and Merrill, and my experience of them in London was really quite extraordinary. They were basically 6 of us, and in a very small office. The office had just opened, and I worked with these guys who were mainly principals who were flying in and out from LA and Chicago and all over, and I didn't know anything. I was just a meager architecture student and not very far on in my education, but had a great summer with them, and they invited me for what we call your year out. In England, you have a year out between your 2 degrees. In England, you actually have to have 2 degrees to be an architect.
Okay.
And between them, you have to go for some practical training. So I got my practical training in Chicago, and one thing led to another, and I came back to the US. No longer for SOM, but after finishing my training, I came back to the United States and settled in Chicago for 7 years. And then, goodness, 8 years ago, was offered an opportunity to go down to Alabama, to go down to Auburn, the School of Architecture there. I'd been an architect and a teacher in Chicago, and was offered the opportunity to go to Auburn, and I didn't know where Auburn was, quite honestly.
You might tell our viewing audience where Auburn is.
Auburn is in East Alabama. It's almost a suburb of Atlanta. All of the Delta pilots put their families in Auburn because it has a good school system, probably similar to this area. If you have lots of academics, the spouses want to go and work in academia, and so anyway, that's where. So Auburn's in the east side of Alabama, and then so I landed there and got offered a job and worked on the campus for a year, and didn't enjoy it as much as I would. I kind of missed Chicago, but in that period of time, I got the opportunity to meet Samuel Mockbee, who was the instigator and inspirer of the Rural Studio, and at the end of the year, he asked me if I'd go and help him, and that was, I guess, was nearly 8 years ago, and they had enough money to last until Christmas. The thing was very much hand to mouth, and for me it was sort of a fantastic opportunity, so I just jumped in with both feet, and from my point of view it's been a ridiculously fun ride, and it's very obviously I'll describe what the rural studio is, but
Exactly, but before we get into that, which we definitely will, for our viewers, you mentioned SOM, and for people acquainted with Chicago, two major SOM buildings are the Hancock and the Sears Tower, and those who have traveled a bit, SOM designed the skeletal framework for Frank Gehry's Bilbao Museum,
That's
and
right.
it's a wonderful triangular structure, and that's how Frank Gehry could put the curved pieces onto.
That's absolutely right.
He's looking at me. He's very surprised I know this, but
You must have been interviewing somebody else.
but just so people make an association
okay.
with where you were working and the kind of opportunities you must have had while you were at SOM.
But it was on a scale that is sort of dramatically different to the work that we do at the Rural Studio in West
Right.
Alabama.
Now you can make those kind of comparisons because SOM does these huge projects and very clever architectural engineering projects. That's
Absolutely.
why I mentioned that museum, because they really very cleverly figured out how to make that skeletal framework, and that's why it could come in under cost on that museum. Well, back to you, now that we've given them this little sideline. Samuel Mockbee seems to be he has passed away, a very interesting character. What is, describe him for the folks so they can have a better understanding how something like a rural studio could possibly evolve.
Goodness. Samuel Mockbee, better known as Sambo, which is sort of part of the story in its own right, to be a white guy in Mississippi and Alabama and go by the nickname of Sambo. Of course, whenever I was with him, people came up and wanted to know where Sambo was. They immediately thought that Sambo would be a black man. But
and the first time I heard you say it, I thought you were irreverent about this individual.
I mean, he carried it off very well. It was actually a nickname given to him by his when he was 3 years old by his sister, and immediately what that did was it sort of broke down stereotypical racial barriers. I mean, people, for me personally, coming from England, the term Sambo is not a nice term. You know, I mean, racially, it's not a nice term, and to go to Alabama and work with a guy that's called Sambo, that term has been flipped on its head, because the guy was basically the guy was a big fat white guy from Mississippi with a politically incorrect nickname, and was a larger-than-life, extraordinary character. One of the better-known architects in the southern part of the United States. Had four children, 3 of whom wanted to go to university, and basically, as an architect, trying to do the sorts of work that he wanted to do, ethically the right kind of work that he wanted to do, wasn't making any money. Got offered a job in education at Auburn, and I think found the academy a little bit frustrating, and had an opportunity to go out to West Alabama and stretch his arms a little bit. He found a place, Hale County, the rural studios are in a place called Hale County. Hale County is the second poorest county in Alabama. Alabama's the second poorest state in the United States. 16,000 people in the state, in the county, sorry. 36% of those people live below the poverty line. An extraordinary 45% of the children under the age of 5 are below the poverty line. So there was an extraordinary need that he found there, but if nothing else, there was a sort of, my goodness, there's opportunity to provide because of just this abject poverty, which is stunning and ridiculous, and made him really angry, quite honestly, and affected him very deeply as a kind of a southern gentleman that could put all hats on. You know, he was well at home in a high-class restaurant in New York, and could play the game and give the Yankees what they needed in New York, but at the same time in the South he was the archetypal Southern gentleman, but knew sort of had a sense of his responsibility, and I think wanted to make the world a better place. I mean, we talked a lot before he died about sort of what he understood to be. I mean, and we sort of talk about the education that the Royal Studio gives to students, and Mockbee and myself coined the phrase "the education of a citizen architect," and this was really just sort of trying to suggest to people that the architect could have a greater role in society than just sort of being the lapdogs to the rich and famous and the people that can afford to have architecture, that you could actually have an impact on the world, make the world a better place, and that if you went off to university and got yourself an education, that in the act of getting yourself an education, not only will you get bettering yourself, but you're there in bettering society, because society has more very well educated person out there. And so he really he tried to sort of really push the students into understanding their broader role and responsibility in society, and I think that was an incredible gift that he gave to people, quite honestly.
You have a picture of
Yeah,
him.
that's the big fat white guy from Mississippi. He's in
There he is.
He's in this kind of rather ridiculous outfit. I always like it because he seems so ridiculous. But
Is that his
but
normal attire when he's?
not really, but he was very relaxed. Let's put it that way. And he liked to have a beer, and was an exuberant character. I mean, I think he very well connected in the South from his career as an architect politically, and went out to West Alabama and literally drove this idea through. And quite honestly, for 7 years did it without the support of the university. And ironically, when he dropped dead, we went to the university and said, look, can we use Sambo's name to try and get an endowment? Can we use his name to help raise money?
Mm-hmm.
And they said no. But what we'll do is we'll give you $400,000 a year for overhead and maintenance to cover your basic costs. And we were like, fantastic. Sambo would have loved it. It's a shame he couldn't have it when he was alive, So, because he was shaking the tin on his own for 7 years and labouring away without the kind of infrastructural support that I have. So, and really just based on his remarkable personality. But I'll be frank with you, he worked himself to death. I mean, it was great opportunity, and he was an opportunist if nothing else. And that's another great sort of lesson that he gave to the students, was take every opportunity and do everything to the best of your ability. The guy was exhaustive. I mean, just 4 years, well, let's say 6 years ago, in the middle of, the Royal Studio's 14 years old, 6 years ago, he contracted leukemia, and he was 2 years in remission from leukemia. We thought he'd kicked it. I mean, he'd done all of the chemo, he'd done all of the good stuff, he'd got a bone marrow transplant from his sister, who then subsequently died of cancer. Can you believe? I mean, the story's so bittersweet, it's not ridiculous. But she died of cancer. We thought he'd kicked it, and then one Christmas 4 years ago, I took him. I was actually in Auburn with him for a faculty meeting. And he said, look, my lungs are clogged up. He worked so hard, we thought he'd just sort of got a bad cold that had become sort of pneumonic. And we took him to the local medical centre, and they checked him in, and they said, yeah, it looks like you've got pneumonia. Anyway, so he drove back to Mississippi that night, and 4 days, it took him 4 days to actually discover that what he had on his lungs was not pneumonic, but it was leukemia. It was leukemic, and they'd misunderstood what they'd seen, and within 2 weeks he was dead, and we could not, just could not credit it, because he had been going 100 miles an hour for the 2 years that he was in recovery, and he was fighting, and I was dragging behind him, picking up the mess behind him. So, but he an extraordinarily inspiring and inspirational figure. I mean, and mythical, in actual fact. I mean, everyone I meet has met him, and everyone that met him just feels as if he was their best friend. He had so much time and spirit and personality for everybody. A really extraordinary character.
And do I add accurately to the wonderful story you've told about him that he was an awarded a MacArthur Genius?
He got the MacArthur Genius Award, and the bittersweet, unfortunately, the bittersweet aspect of that story is that the thing was paid in installments. It's $500,000 over. No, it was $500,000 over 5 years, right? Nice chunk of change. It was going to look after his son, who had sort of certain learning disability, and he died 2 days before the second payment was due, and that was the end of it. You know, the MacArthur Award doesn't go to people that suddenly die. It doesn't even go to the family, and everyone was up in arms about it. But it's essentially not something that MacArthur could change. I think they were as upset as everybody else was. So, but anyway, 2 years ago, the AIA, which is sort of a relatively conservative.
The American Institute of Architects, for our viewers.
Yeah, which is the sort of the representative body of architects in the United States, which, I'll probably get shot for saying this, but relatively conservative organization. They got their get together and kind of very much provoked by the southern AIA regional groups. Mm-hmm. Who were campaigning for him and posthumously gave Sambo and they're in sort of the Rural Studio the AIA Gold Medal posthumously, and I think that was a fantastic tribute and to the impact that the work has had on the profession, I think, as well. I mean, I think it's an education that provokes. It asks questions about the way that we teach and the way we practice as architects, and I think it's a very thought-provoking and interesting. That's why I'm there. That's why I'm in the middle of nowhere teaching this program, because it really asks some good, tough questions about why and how we teach and what we make and what we do as architects.
And this gives me a chance to check. Did I not see a drawing that he had done for the World Trade Center area, and it was done while he was in the hospital?
That's right. He was on his sickbed. The guy
just didn't stop.
He'd never stopped. I mean, he drew. His passion was drawing, and
it was a rather nice drawing.
Beautiful. I mean, the guy could draw like a dream. In fact, I almost ceased to be able to draw because I was so embarrassed at my ineptitude at sitting next to him when he was drawing. And it's just. He's one of these people, and at 57 years old, he was very comfortable with who he was and what he drew, and it came very naturally to him. When he did a drawing, I mean, everything he drew was really quite real. It was as if you could sort of make a construction drawing out of what he made. He had had enough experience of building and making that he knew the dimensions of things as well. So they are very evocative drawings, but they are almost drawings that you could build from. I mean, everything was in there. But it was, he always talked about how he felt that architects came to maturity at the age of 60, and that they did their best work at the age of 60.
You are in a great profession for that being the case.
Yeah, yes. Ironically enough, he didn't make it to 60, but I saw him so confident in what he was doing. It was really remarkable. It was like it was coming true, was what he said, because he felt confident and comfortable in what he knew, what he was doing. There was sort of not any doubts. It felt right. Let's put it that way. And as an architect, you're sort of always having this struggle. But for him, it was he knew what he kind of knew what he liked, I guess. So let's put it that way.
Didn't question those things.
Yeah.
Well, we are going to show some slides of the incredible projects that were done, and I do want to underline what you pointed out. This was done scrambling.
Can I steal your water?
You may steal my water, absolutely.
We can share.
I told Andrew that this is very informal, but I do want to underline that this was an entity that was always on a shoestring. So when you see the pictures of the students and the faculty over time who were involved with the studio to keep that in mind. But we're getting the impression that it's this incredible personality that must have come upon the School of Architecture to convince them to send the students or set up the program so that the students go down and actually live in New Bern, Alabama for, I think you've told me, a full semester, maybe even a longer commitment. Yeah. So tell us a bit about that so our viewers really understand the kind of commitment not only of you previously, Samuel Mockbee, but then the students put in a lot of commitment.
Yeah, well, we live in a community of 200 people. It is it's a relatively poor area, obviously.
And sort of the red dirt areas, I've heard
it's the Black Belt, and it's not called the Black Belt because there's a whole bunch of black folks there. It's because of that beautiful red dirt that's formed at the tail end of the Appalachian Mountain Trail. But that red dirt also pervade the cotton crop.
Right.
Very good for that. And ironically enough, today, the major industry down there, if you like, is the catfish industry. Because that clay, that red dirt, doesn't actually perk very well. In fact, it won't drain at all. So
of course,
if you want to dig a hole and fill it full of water and then throw some catfish in there, it actually works quite well. So all our dairy farmers have diversified into that. But to answer your question, we were talking a little bit earlier. The nature of education today and the nature of society today is that it's so litigious. It encourages me as an architect and a teacher to make sure that that these things are well put together, and they're also highly engineered. I mean, you do a building like this that's 4,500 square feet and essentially 3 stories high, and it has to. It doesn't want to fall down when a hurricane comes through.
I was going to say withstand the winds that go through this area. Actually, it's quite delightful looking, lighted.
Yeah.
Have they turned it into somewhat of a multi-purpose structure? So do any community things?
Well, this is the thing you can see in this image that this was actually at the opening ceremony. But the idea was that the side of the building opens up, and they kind of have. You can see the tables lined up on the left-hand side. They have community parties out there, and they do these sort of Boston butt sales where they have a community party to kind of raise funds for the fire station as well. So, they're I mean, this was a gift that we gave to the town of New Bern because they had been our hosts for the last 10 years, and they had an opportunity to get these fire trucks, and they needed a shelter for it. What they could afford was a little butler building, and we said, well, you go buy the butler building and we'll give you something that has a civic presence for the town. And so, they've taken ownership of it. They made the sign for it. They put the flag up for it. They trust us now. I mean, I think that 14 years ago the Rural Studio went out, Sambo went out there as this kind of maverick figure in the middle of a field with a bunch of students with long hair, and nobody really kind of believed them. And
so when do you think that trust started easing in?
It's probably took 8 to 10 years. Mm-hmm. I think certainly when Sambo died, they thought the thing would die as well, because it's quite personality based. I mean, it's a tough place to live, and you have to want to be there. I mean, unlike in your beautiful city, there are no good places to go and eat, and no good bars, and no great recreational activities, no cultural activities as such. You can go fishing and drink a beer on the porch, but it's from a teacher's point of view. I have the students in the middle of nowhere with nothing else to do but build fire stations, and they're incredibly entrepreneurial. Being very young, they dig themselves extremely big holes and get themselves in incredible messes but keep digging until they come out on the other side, and they recognise it as a sort of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to try and kind of do it the right way, and see how difficult it is to do it right, whatever that right might be. But they really get taken in by, these folks, the students on this, were fed every day. I mean, they had no worries in terms of living, because the locals were looking after them, and at weekends the locals would come and help them build it as well. So there's a degree of shared sweat, of course. I mean, our students are doing this stuff 24 hours a day. You can't expect people who've got a job to come in and work with them all the time, but they offer themselves when they can. So it's been a really rewarding aspect of that, to see how they've taken us in. I mean, I would say that it's just, to all intents and purposes now, we're sort of the county architect. Last year, Hale County and Greensboro, the nearest small town, they asked us to replan and rebuild their largest park in West Alabama, which is called Lions Park. It's a 40-acre park. That's what we've been doing this year. We're building an animal shelter for Hale County. We've just finished a new courtyard for the local hospital. We're doing a Boys and Girls Club up in another town called Akron. So they're very, the buildings are, I think, are beginning to serve more and more people, and the local politicians particularly are beginning to kind of imagine what we can do and help them with, and they've become very good clients, and that's and very smart, very wise, not understanding of architecture, but they understand when things are well built, and they understand the spirit of the students, and they engage with the students. It's nice for a community like this to have young students coming into a place where normally young people want to get out, and we bring young people in, and they have energy and passion and drive and desire, and the activity of building and making is such a positive thing. I mean, it gives me goosebumps. I mean, they allow us to offer them things, and the reciprocation is to be a good, thoughtful client and a good neighbour, and care, and really that's it. There's not a lot of money about to do anything, but our role then relative to all of that is to make sure that these buildings are as maintenance free as possible.
Right.
So yeah, I think that the thing has evolved into sort of almost like a public service, honestly, and that I think has it's brought new challenges to the studio, brought new challenges to the students, but at the same time we still do the individual family houses. We're also looking at the moment at doing we're trying to take on the issue of sort of dealing with the housing issue. Obviously, in the last 14 years, we've essentially built 1 or 2 houses each year, along with the community projects. The house that we're particularly looking at the moment is for a $20,000 rural development grant, and they give that to people that are on welfare. It's essentially a loan. If you're on welfare, you can get it. It's the sum that people on welfare can afford. And with that, the nature of the loan is that you have to go and find a builder to build you a house. $20,000 is not an awful lot of money to build a house with. And so we're working on this premise that what can we basically build with $10,000 in materials? And I should try and find it here.
Okay.
It's probably going to take me a while.
That's
slow
okay.
This machine is.
And while you're doing that again, I do have a Phil conversation here, and that is, you're talking about the trust that built up. Say it even took up to 10 years, but that's there, and they know you very well. So is it such that you are your engagement with the people in the community is so that you're planning ahead for the community on what will be built, and even housing, so that they might increase their population? Maybe they don't want to increase their population. I shouldn't have made that assumption, but in case they do, are they talking about housing being built so that others can move into this community?
Yeah, no, they are. I think it's, like I say, quite honestly, from the rural studios point of view, there was a good deal of suspicion, and we've had to sort of take ourselves from. I mean, the price to pay is these projects take longer.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And that's
Yes. And you made that very clear in the length of time.
The sacrifice is that length of time, and there's been a degree of criticism about the students having to be here for a longer period of time. But actually, it's helped build those relationships that I talked about that ends up making things that are of worth. Now, finally, I've found the $20,000 house.
Good.
But I.
Well, and again, you've underlined that things do take quite a bit of time, and I like to sort of draw a line under that, so people do realize that they don't happen tomorrow.
Well, no, absolutely, and it's I mean, all of these small communities, there's no, I mean, one of the things about sort of planning is that there's sort of an assumption made about resources in the future, and there's so few resources in these places, and there's a pace of life that changes so very slowly that one building, one small intervention, one house can have a huge impact. And what we do, I hope, is to sort of try and understand the fabric of the place, both emotionally, intellectually, and culturally, how to fit into that. The $20,000 house.
Do we have that up now? Okay, there we go.
Is really, from my point of view, is very interesting. The challenge. I mean, there's an awful lot of talk about low-income, low-cost housing, and I'm always I'm disappointed with it because it doesn't really sound like it's particularly cheap. Honestly, I mean, in England, I've just been to England, and they're talking about doing a house for £60,000 as being a low-income house, which is $120,000. To me, that doesn't sound either affordable or cheap. And I know that you have to be careful with semantics, because nobody wants quote unquote a cheap house, and nobody wants quote unquote low-income house. What we're trying to do with this little house is give somebody something that will appreciate. The competition for a house like this, unfortunately, where I live, is the trailer. The trailer, you can go down to essentially to a car lot. You get it on the Never Never. You can put a down payment for it. You can take it away, and you can have your dream home. The problem with that is that the house it depreciates. You pay for it over. Suddenly, the free windows are in the design, and they're manipulating those windows to work. And it's just. They're asked to think on their feet very quickly, and asked to make an awful lot of sort of grown up and sensible decisions for what are very young people. But I think that at the end of the day, I would suggest that three amazing things about the education. One is the arts and crafts tradition of architecture, the understanding the connection between the drawn line and what you make, having the opportunity to make, appreciating the nature of the materials, the smell on the fingers,
and the pride in the end product.
The pride in the end product. The opportunity to live in a small town where everyone knows what you're doing, and everyone talks to you about what you're doing, and is very nosy about what you're doing. So you can read between the lines on that one, but it's a blessing in disguise sometimes, of course. And then the other one is they get to work in teams, and our educational process at the moment typically doesn't allow for that very well. And for me, and probably for you, you go to work to be with people most of the time. I mean, that's sort of obviously we have
it's
to
the
put
collective
food on
knowledge
the
you're talking about.
Yeah, and they don't really have that, and that opportunity to engage with each other and fight with each other and start to say what is of value to them and negotiate that with their teammates and then with a client is an extraordinary thing to have to do. We're not, at the Rural Studio, when we do our public presentations, the students are really expected to rehearse. We rehearse time and time and time again, because if what you put up on the wall is beautiful, if what comes out of your mouth is ridiculous, you've lost it. And
Mm-hmm.
so you really have to be very careful with your semantics. You have to. I mean, we go to rooms and we arrange. You of course do this, but you arrange the furniture so that people won't be afraid to go look at the drawings. I mean, it's little things like that about human behaviour that they start to understand and get confidence about, because you can't speak the architectural lingo. You've got to cut the bullshit, honestly. You've got to get that archi lingo that we've been learning for 5 years out of your system, so the everyday guy can actually understand what you're talking about. And that's a fantastically rewarding situation for them when folks get it and when they start to ask the questions that they wouldn't have been asking if they hadn't been involved in it. It takes them time. I mean, you can imagine if you take a piece of architecture to your parents and say, "Oh, what do you think about this?" Well, what can they say? They haven't been through what we've all been through in the academic realm, and so they have no context to it. But when you start to explain it and you use models and you use three-dimensional things, they start to get into it and start to make choices. Most of them are very pragmatic choices. Most of it's about money. But the way we sneak the architecture in is by saying, well, you can actually make architecture out of really ventilating something very well. The cool air comes in at the bottom and the hot air goes out at the top, so that immediately begins to form a building.
Mm-hmm.
And they appreciate that. They don't want to they don't want to pay for the heating, they don't want to pay for the air conditioning. So that's how you begin a dialogue about making form. In fact, we very rarely, I with my students, there's lots of discussions about the sort of the wacky nature of the things, the way the Rural Studio projects look. I very rarely have a conversation with my students about what it looks like. Most of the time it's about the choice of materials, using materials that are sustainable with a small s, that will last a very long time. We've got a little bit of money. How can we choose materials that will last as long as they can possibly last, not need maintaining, not need painting, and are the right thing to do to the planet, that they're locally sourced, they're not oil-based, all of that good stuff, not mineral-based. And, we're hypocrites. Sometimes we do things that we're not very proud of, but most of the time it's a sort of it's an ethical conversation about what's the right thing to do, not what can we do. What we can do anything. There's so much need there. You can do whatever you want. But quite honestly, the question is, what is the right thing to do? And to add complication to that, again, people often say, well, you're in a place where you don't have building permits. Well, the truth of the matter is, we don't have building permits. He wants me to finish, does he? We don't. Yeah.
Dollar houses.
No, absolutely.
Andrew has just shared with us so many different ways for us to be thinking about it, but I think the question that he leaves us with is, why aren't our architecture students and urban planning students and landscape architecture students in some rural area here in Illinois doing a similar thing where we go and live with that community and really get to know those residents so that what we design is not what we think they should have, but actually what they are telling us they would like to see design. Andrew, thank you so much, and thank you for coming for the Planning Institute and coming from Alabama. And remember, planning matters.
Yeah.